a civil servant of that day has been writing his memoirs recently, and he has put it in print what we knew anecdotally at that time, that there was a permanent secretary by the name of N.Q. Dias in the early 1960s, who was the permanent secretary for External Affairs and Defense to Mrs. Bandaranaike. He made it a policy, and he used an army coup which could not have succeeded anyway as the excuse to keep minorities, Tamils and Christians out of the armed forces, out of the high echelons of the civil service. And so the major state institutions were appropriated by particular sections, by particular section of the country. And that was not, in my view, an authentic response to Sinhalese nationalism itself. It was more a response to the feudal ambitions of the Sinhalese political leaders. And that can be established. And in fact, they used nationalism for electoral purposes, and they won government power, not so much to address the needs of the people, but to entrench themselves in power and to share the glories of state power among family members. And it was not for nothing that the very witty Communist Party leader Peter Kenneman called the UNP, which was the first governing party in Sri Lanka, which was supposed to be United National Party, he called it the Uncle-Nephew Party. and it has been the case, and the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, which was its counter, has been later dubbed as Sri Lanka Family Party. So the nationalism that both Ahilan and Rohini have been talking about in the context of Sri Lanka, it has been used, especially among the Sinhalese, to advance family interests. And in the case of the Tamils, how has it worked? One of the Tamil problem, feudalism in Tamil politics is much less pronounced than among the Sinhalese. That's my view. And but there has been electoral competition among different political parties. So from the time, whenever there was no accommodation of Tamil interests or Tamil rights in the government, the minority parties, for their own electoral advantage, ratcheted their demand higher than the other party. One party, if it wants a conference, it used to be called a roundtable conference of all the political parties and arrive at a solution, the other party would say we want only federalism. But what was at the crux of everything was a fear of the process of representation, and that's something that has to be addressed in any post-war situation. How the Sinhalese are in a predominantly majority situation. But as Qadri Ismail has been writing, that shouldn't mean anything in a democracy. Numbers shouldn't mean anything when it comes to democratic rights, human rights, and opportunities. So the fact that Tamils or Muslims are much fewer in numbers should not be a factor. But that is where the state of Sri Lanka started hitting at the minorities. Rohini has referred to the disenfranchisement of the plantation workers. It went far beyond that, because what happened was, at that point, the Indian plantation Tamils slightly exceeded the Sri Lankan Tamils in numbers. So they were all disenfranchised, but they were counted for demarcating electorates. They lived in the midst of Sinhalese areas. They were disenfranchised, they could not vote, but their population was added to demarcate the number of electorates in those provinces, because for every 75,000 population you get a seat in parliament. So that whole area was, the population was, their total numbers were used, so they got more seats. So the rural Sinhalese MP from those provinces had a much greater weightage than urban Sinhalese MPs. That's where the left base was. And when they took away the plantation workers' voting rights, the left suffered severely. And they also, the other concept was, the Tamils' reaction was, they wanted to preserve the majority in the two provinces. They were never opposed to Sinhalese going and living there. What they were opposed to was the state-aided colonization of those areas. And that was changing the balance, the ethnic balance, especially in the eastern province, and it has happened now. So in effect, what it meant was two Sinhalese parties, the main parties, could form governments on their own on the votes, on the representation they had among the Sinhalese. And the left had no choice in that context. And that is one reason, one reason why they went into the coalition strategy. Because they were being reduced to parliamentary marginality without that arrangement. The mistake, of course, was by that time the Tamils, all Tamil political parties had begun to identify themselves with the right-wing Sinhalese majority party, and that gave the left the excuse that we would resolve their problem on our own in being alliance with the SLP. So that was the split, yeah. And so it's a long history, and I'm saying so. In India, things have been different. In Pakistan, Bangladesh, we know the problems there. So in Sri Lanka, the way the state power was appropriated, abused, that has a great deal to do with the situation that Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans are in, and that has also a great deal to do with the demise of the left and the emergence of the LTT. Even today, if we look at the present situation, the LTT cannot be considered or critiqued in isolation of a similar consideration and critique of the Sri Lankan state. Between 1994 and 2005, what the LTT did was highly responsible because there were overtures, more than overtures, coming from the state of Sri Lanka through the governments of Kumaratunga and the peace process. But after that, from the time this president has won election, it has gone back to a situation worse than what was there in 1956 when Sinhala was made official. I mean, not just in war, the whole tenor of politics, the whole emphasis, the nuances, the language. If you look at the Sri Lankan government website, you would think there is nobody else living in this country who should be worth living. And that's the context that we are in. And that LTTE, for it is a sweep. It reflects on them. It gives them strength. Somebody asks, how do you explain LTTE becoming strong in spite of the military defeat? Any strength the LTTE has is a reflection of the government's own hostility towards the Tamils. And the war itself is something that they deliberately entered into. They totally ignored and rolled back every constitutional possibility that was considered till the present incumbent, Mahinda Rajapaksa, came to power. And they are, even now, they are not making any promise or any indication that they will do any change. Ahilan was talking about what would happen after the war. I'm not sanguine at all that anything would happen under this government the way they are going. The only way they say, all right, if you take, they are not listening to any pressure now, from Secretary Clinton to Indian Prime Minister, everybody at least give. Now they have crushed the LTT to the point that it's almost impossible for it to mount a campaign again the way it has done in the past. So that argument doesn't hold. And why wouldn't you give some relief to the people who are there? And they are both wrong. Just because the LTT surrenders, the government is not going to stop the war. They have been doing this for 1 year, bombing places. No country fights its own internal terrorism using its air force. I don't think there is any example of that. You go and invade, put bombs in somebody else's place. Not that it is right, but this is the worst of the worst things. And so the Sri Lankan government, and it is difficult to imagine that this government is not listening to anybody of how to do it a little differently in a war situation. Why it would listen to anybody to do anything different after the war, if the war comes to